Okay, so today we're going really deep on this guy, John Anderson. He was this Scottish philosopher, kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people, but his impact was, well, it was huge, especially in Australia where he spent most of his career.
Yeah, from like 1927 until he retired in 58. What gets me is how, even though he was kind of isolated down there, he still managed to shape a whole generation of students and spark some serious public debates.
Yeah, it's a weird chapter in the history of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
He's this guy you might not know off the top of your head, but his influence, man, it's undeniable, especially when you look at Australian philosophy. And for us as philosophers, what makes it even more interesting is how he developed this really unique and systematic philosophical outlook. It wasn't just him parroting back what was going on in Europe at the time. He was forging his own path, often going completely against the grain.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're going to try to get at today in this deep dive. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on John Anderson as our guide for this little intellectual expedition. It really gives us a good look at his robust realist philosophy, which, gotta say, really shook things up in his time. For you as a philosopher, I think you'll find his systematic approach and his critiques of idealism and the way we usually think about epistemology, well, let's just say they'll definitely get you thinking.
Oh, absolutely. The goal today is to really break down the main parts of Anderson's philosophy, see how it impacted things, and try to understand why he remains kind of a mysterious figure in the bigger picture of philosophy. It's a lot, but when you think about all the different people he engaged with, from those ancient Greek philosophers to Freud, William James, even Samuel Alexander, you start to see just how deep his thinking went.
Right. He wasn't afraid to tackle anything. Given our focus here, maybe a good place to start is with a sketch of his intellectual journey, like how he got from point A to point B. The Stanford entry lays out his life pretty well and highlights the key things that pushed him towards this super distinct form of realism he ended up with.
For sure. So he was born in Stonehouse, Scotland. His dad was a schoolmaster, super involved with the Independent Labour Party. So from the get-go, you can see that Anderson grew up in a setting that valued intellectual and political engagement. And then he goes to the University of Glasgow, ends up with degrees in math and dives into logic and moral philosophy, even wrote his master's thesis on William James back in 1917. And don't forget, this is all happening during World War I and all that intense labor unrest in Red Clydeside. I mean, talk about formative experiences. He must have had a front row seat to all those social and political clashes.
As philosophers, we can see how those kinds of early life events can shape a person's whole philosophical outlook, right? Seeing all that societal turmoil firsthand probably fed into his later emphasis on the role of conflict and his really hard-nosed realist view of the world.
Yeah, totally. But then, in 1918, there's this huge turning point. The Australian philosopher Samuel Alexander gives those famous Gifford lectures in Glasgow. And these lectures had a massive effect on Anderson. They pulled him away from the idealism he was leaning towards. I mean, the guy even got an award for an essay backing an idealist view of the state. So Alexander's lectures basically set Anderson on this new course towards systematic realism. Talk about a philosophical 180.
It's really interesting for us, right, how one philosophical system can just come in and knock another one right out of a thinker's head. Alexander's realism obviously provided the structure that really clicked with Anderson's own developing ideas about how reality works.
So then, a few years pass, he gets married, does some teaching gigs, and bam, in 1927, he heads down to the University of Sydney in Australia, snags the prestigious Challis Chair of Philosophy, a position he held on to until he called it quits in 58. That's a lot of time to develop and spread his philosophical ideas, even if it was in that relative isolation we talked about.
Absolutely. And, during that time, the entry tells us he had this crazy teaching schedule. He wrote his most important articles. And get this, he even helped keep the Australasian Journal of Psychology and Philosophy going. This guy was clearly dedicated to both creating and sharing philosophical thought.
No doubt. Now, here's where things get really juicy if you want to understand the man behind the philosophy. Early on, he was involved with the Communist Party of Australia, even acted as an advisor on theory for a while. But later on, his views did a complete flip, and he ended up being firmly anti-communist. And this wasn't some quiet change of heart. He was out there right in the middle of public controversies over things like censorship, university changes, academic freedom. He even fought against religious teaching in schools. And the entry brings up this super important point for any philosopher who thinks about how philosophy fits into public life. Did all that intense public involvement actually help or hurt his philosophical work? It's a question worth chewing on for sure.
It really makes you consider the relationship between philosophical inquiry and actually getting involved in social and political stuff. Was Anderson's philosophy just this abstract thing in his head, or was it tied to the big issues of his day? His students, many of whom became pretty well-known philosophers themselves, they seem to see a strong link.
Right, and speaking of those students, the list is pretty impressive for a guy who was supposedly working in isolation. You got Armstrong, Mackey, Passmore, Kamenka, Stove, Baker. These are all heavy hitters in philosophy, and they all say Anderson had a huge influence on them. That shows you how much impact he had in the academic world, even if he wasn't always in the spotlight of those big international philosophical debates.
Yeah, for sure. And get this, the Sydney philosophy department actually split up after he died in 72, partly because of arguments over philosophical and teaching approaches. That tells you something about the power of his ideas, how they could even be divisive. It means people weren't just passively accepting his ideas, they were debating them, arguing over them.
Okay, so now we've got a better sense of the philosopher and what his world was like. Let's dig into the core of his system, the thing he called systematic realism. The entry highlights this idea of independence as being super important. Can you break down what independence means in Anderson's world and why it matters so much?
Sure. For Anderson, independence is this basic ontological principle. It says that things exist with their own properties and characteristics, regardless of how they relate to other things, our minds, or what we might use them for. He thought that constitutive relations, the idea that a thing's whole nature is defined by its relationships, was a big mistake made by idealist thinkers.
So basically, a thing is what it is, period. It doesn't matter if we're looking at it or how it interacts with other stuff. That's a pretty strong commitment to the idea that reality is objective.
It is. And this idea leads directly to his concept of a single way of being. He argued that everything that's real, no matter how abstract or how much it seems to go beyond the everyday world, can only be understood in terms of our regular spatio-temporal world. So that means there aren't different types or levels of truth, there's no special realm for universals or values, and even our minds aren't separate from the physical world.
So if we're thinking like philosophers here, this is him rejecting any form of Platonism or dualism, right?
Yeah.
Universals like redness or justice. They don't exist in some perfect separate world of forms. They're part of the world of red things and just actions.
Exactly. For Anderson, universals exist right here in the everyday world, always in specific instances. There's no ontological hierarchy, no level above or below the actual reality of a state of affairs, a subject with a predicate.
And that's where logic comes in, doesn't it? It plays a key role in his system. As the study of the formal features of facts, logic basically tells us what's objectively real. For Anderson, logic implies a general ontology. He's connecting our logical frameworks with the very nature of being itself. That's a pretty tight link.
It is. It shows just how dedicated he was to a unified, coherent understanding of reality. Logic, for him, wasn't just some tool we use to reason. It reflected the basic structure of what exists.
But he also made it clear that it's hard to achieve a truly objective understanding, and he stressed the importance of critical inquiry. This independent reality, it's not something we just grasp effortlessly, is it?
Not at all. Anderson knew that reality itself is complex, with all its inherent conflicts and tensions, and he knew we have subjective biases that cloud our understanding. He thought real knowledge comes from constantly engaging with the world in a rigorous, critical way.
And what about his ideas on ethics? The entry mentions ethical goods as being found in activities that have internal standards, things like intellectual inquiry or making art. That's different from those traditional ethical theories that focus on external rules or the consequences of actions.
Absolutely. Anderson didn't think ethical investigation was about setting up external rules or obligations. For him, it was about figuring out which human activities have inherent value, the ones that are guided by their own internal standards of excellence and correctness, independent of any external rewards or utilitarian calculations. And he saw these activities as kind of fragile, existing in a world that's always at risk of stagnation and corruption. That shows a bit of a pessimistic side to his thinking.
Okay, so now we have a basic outline of his systematic realism. But let's get specific, put on our philosopher hats, and see how these ideas work in particular areas. Let's start with logic. The entry says he thought logic deals with objective statements of fact, and these statements can be reduced to the classic Aristotelian A, E, I, O forms. Can you give us an example of how he'd analyze a statement from this perspective?
Well, he thought any statement that actually meant something was an assertion of a fact, a description of something having a certain property. One of the examples from the entry is, many hands make light work. He'd analyze that as the A form. All shared activities are lightened, and another one, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs, becomes the E form. No omelets are things made without breaking eggs. For him, reducing these complex statements down to these basic propositional forms was crucial for clear, rigorous philosophical analysis.
It's a very direct approach to language and truth, almost like getting back to basics. He also believed that universal propositions assert a simple fact and assume that the subject matter actually exists. So if we say all swans are white, that simply means each individual swan has the property of being white, and it assumes that swans exist in the first place.
Right. And he took this even further by rejecting the idea of analytic truth. He argued that if a proposition tells us anything about the world, it has to be potentially falsifiable. He also disagreed with Mill's idea of inductivism. He thought we experience generality and relations directly, so a single, well-understood instance could, in theory, establish a universal proposition, though it would always be provisional.
And even though other systems of logic were popping up, he stuck with the syllogism as being fundamental. He saw it as showing how a subject in one proposition could become the predicate in another. The point was, the difference between subject and predicate is just about their role in the proposition, not some fundamental difference in the type of entity they are.
And what's super interesting for us as philosophers is how he stuck with this traditional logical framework and saw it as the science of the most general features of reality. It wasn't just some tool for arguing, it was, in his view, a description of how facts are structured and the conditions that make it possible for us to even have a conversation.
But of course, the entry mentions that Mackey had some serious problems with this logical framework. He pointed out that it's hard to account for false propositions, singular propositions, multiple quantification, and relational propositions if you're sticking to the Aristotelian forms. It seems like holding on to this traditional system had its limitations when dealing with all the nuances of language and thought.
Yeah, Mackey argued that a good logic needs to deal with propositions that go beyond just saying what exists. He thought concepts like falsity, negation, and hypothetical reasoning need a more flexible framework than what the Aristotelian syllogism allows.
So let's move on to metaphysics. Anderson thought that realist movements before him didn't really succeed because they couldn't offer a systematic alternative to the influence of Hegelian idealism. He admired Hegel's attempt to build a comprehensive system, even though he totally disagreed with Hegel's view of propositions.
That's a key insight into what motivated Anderson. As a philosopher, he saw how powerful and persuasive a comprehensive philosophical system could be. But he thought Hegel's idealism messed up the independence of facts and truths. For Anderson, ditching Hegel's doctrine of expressions meant basing our understanding on actual states of affairs, not on some abstract being unfolding.
So his goal was to build a new, tough kind of systematic realism. He drew inspiration from all over the place, Greek philosophy, especially Heraclitus, plus Freud, James, and Alexander. The influence of Heraclitus, with his emphasis on conflict, change, and getting rid of subjectivism, that seems pretty strong.
Definitely. Anderson saw Heraclitus as someone who got it, someone who understood that reality is dynamic and full of tension, not simple and static. This fit perfectly with Anderson's own commitment to a world where things are interacting and opposing each other.
He also took on Kant. Right. He liked Kant's focus on empirical observation, but disagreed with his representationalism and that sharp line he drew between phenomena and noumena, the things in themselves. Following Alexander, Anderson proposed a realist alternative where space and time are basic forms of being, and he reinterpreted Kant's categories as categories of being. That way we could understand the objects of scientific inquiry as the things in themselves, directly accessible to us.
That was a crucial move for his realist metaphysics. By getting rid of that Kantian middleman, that layer of phenomenal experience, Anderson wanted to ground our knowledge directly in the real world, without all that potential for skepticism that comes with representationalism.
And his take on universals is particularly interesting for us. Mounce suggested that Anderson's view might end up as nominalism, the idea that only individual things exist and universals are just names or concepts. That connects to the later work of his student Armstrong, who spent a lot of time wrestling with that ancient problem of the one and the many that goes all the way back to Plato. And on top of that, Mackey worried that Anderson's logic might have an element of a priorism, and he pointed out the problems that come up if you weaken that tight connection Anderson made between logic and ontology. Looks like his system had some pretty tough challenges to deal with from different philosophical angles.
Yeah, if the link between logic and the basic structure of reality isn't as direct and necessary as Anderson said, then the foundations of his single way of being and how he analyzed social phenomena, well, they become a lot less certain. And the rise of linguistic philosophy, which the entry talks about with Price, presented a whole other challenge. Linguistic philosophy questioned that basic assumption that language has to directly mirror ontological structures.
Right. So in epistemology, Anderson famously rejected what he saw as a wrong turn in modern philosophy that focused on the problem of knowledge and the Cartesian obsession with finding absolutely certain foundations for our beliefs. He thought the ancient Greeks were smarter about this because they didn't prioritize epistemology over ontology.
He thought this modern obsession with how we know was a form of scientific defeatism, like giving in to skepticism too early. Anderson saw empiricism as primarily an ontological statement, saying there aren't any higher or non-material forms of being rather than just a theory about where knowledge comes from or how we justify it.
And his view of truth was incredibly direct. Truth is just what the copula conveys, the eight is, in a proposition. He rejected both the correspondence and coherence theories of truth. He argued that propositions aren't representations of states of affairs, but are in fact the states of affairs themselves. That's a hardcore version of direct realism.
It is. He thought those representationalist theories of truth inevitably lead to the very skepticism he was trying to avoid. By saying that propositions are the same as the realities they describe, he aimed to ground truth in the world itself.
And then there's his mind is feeling thesis, which is really wild because it breaks away from traditional ideas about consciousness. He said that mentality isn't some separate substance, but belongs to the spatio-temporal realm. So he's rejecting that Cartesian subject-object dualism. He even took a Nietzschean approach, seeing the mind as a social structure made up of instincts and passions that compete and cooperate, and feelings themselves are what do the basic work of striving.
It's a bold and unconventional take on things, that's for sure. By putting the mind in the physical world and calling it a dynamic interplay of feelings, Anderson tried to solve the mind-body problem that's been bugging Western philosophy forever.
As we mentioned earlier, in ethics, he was all about identifying good as a quality that's built into activities that have their own internal standards of excellence. Moral prescriptions for him came from social norms and customs, while the philosophical study of ethics is about examining the real objective qualities of what humans do. And again, he emphasized how conflict and struggle are central to the ethical sphere, showing that Heraclitus influence.
His ethical theory is firmly rooted in the observable world of human practices. He wasn't into abstract moral ideals or duties imposed from outside. He wanted to find goodness in the very nature of certain activities, like intellectual inquiry or art, when they're done according to their own internal criteria for success.
He also gave a sociological interpretation of those traditional moral concepts. He even had his own take on devotion to a cause as an ethical virtue, and saw sin as a feeling of inadequacy in relation to social movements. But Mackey, his former student, had a big problem with Anderson's ethical theory. He thought it was a bad explanation of how we use moral language and reason. It's interesting, though, because Mackey's own ethical subjectivism still engaged with Anderson's underlying realism about the world.
It goes to show how complex and sometimes even contentious philosophical influence can be. Even the people who really disagreed with Anderson's conclusions still grappled with the basic assumptions in his system. Ries, another of his students, had a different critique. He suggested that Anderson's focus on activities might have missed how personal and urgent individual moral dilemmas can be.
So, in his social and political thought, you can see the influence of Sorel and Proudhon, especially in his distinction between the ethic of the producer and the ethic of the consumer. He didn't think the state was the main thing to analyze in politics. Instead, he focused on how different social movements, institutions, and traditions all interact dynamically. And he ended up criticizing socialism as a political movement with a fixed goal. He thought it could lose its power to liberate people if it relied too much on solutions from the state.
His focus on social movements and all the conflicts within society gives us a dynamic and definitely non-statist view of political life. His critique of idealism carried over to political philosophy, and his eventual skepticism about socialism came from his deep belief in individual agency and the importance of staying critical and engaged in struggles.
And lastly, in education, he rejected those utilitarian viewpoints. He saw education as having its own inherent values, developing critical thinking and that process of finding a way of life. He was a big fan of classical education as a tradition of critical thought and resisted imposing external standards. He thought real learning is a tough process, and it moves forward by overcoming obstacles.
His emphasis on critical thinking and the value of education itself is still relevant today. He saw education as this crucial force for cultivating intellectual independence and standing up to the pressures of conformity.
It's really something how Anderson's influence went beyond the university walls. You've got the story of Futahilo in Tonga, and the founding of the Etanisi Institute. That's a powerful example of how Anderson's realism inspired the creation of a whole educational institution based on classical Greek ideals. He even played a role in shaping democratic movements in Tonga.
It really shows you how philosophical ideas, even ones that seem really abstract, can have a real impact on the world.
And then there's the Sydney Push, this interesting group of anti-establishment intellectuals, artists, and journalists who were super influenced by Anderson's ideas about critical opposition, taking risks, and rejecting consumerism. Big names like Germaine Greer, Robert Hughes, and Clive James were all part of that scene. Even George Molnar, even though he had some major philosophical disagreements with Armstrong, still had a connection to Anderson's thought.
It shows how broad Anderson's intellectual appeal was and how his ideas could inspire people to be critical and live differently, even outside of academic philosophy.
The entry does say that it's hard to fully get Anderson's work today. His lectures were really important for context, he was relatively isolated from those international philosophical debates, and the way his students focused on specific things might shape how we interpret him. Even Ryle, who came from that very different linguistic philosophy background, initially misunderstood what Anderson was trying to do, and his philosophical language can be pretty confusing for readers today.
It's a reminder that for us as philosophers, it's crucial to engage with historical thinkers within their own intellectual and historical context. Anderson, being somewhat isolated, while it might have helped him develop his unique perspective, also made it harder for people to understand and engage with his ideas.
So where does that leave his philosophical legacy? The entry gives us a couple of contrasting views. Was he this philosophical giant who tried to build a whole system but didn't quite get there? Or was he so dominant that he accidentally prevented Australian philosophy from engaging with other developments? The fact that the Sydney Philosophy Department split up after he died really reflects those debates. In the end, even though people might not be directly engaging with his work as much these days, his influence through his many famous students is clear. He's still a complex and important figure in the history of philosophy, even if he's sometimes overlooked.
It seems like his attempt to build a complete and lasting realist philosophy, even if it didn't get the widespread recognition he might have wanted, still had a huge impact on Australian philosophy and shaped how his many influential students thought. His ideas shaped the philosophical landscape for decades.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we went through John Anderson's ambitious, systematic realism, his critiques of idealism and the way we usually think about epistemology, his unique take on logic as being tied to ontology, his ethics based on human activities, his interesting views on social and political thought, and his ideas about the inherent value of education. And we even saw how his influence went beyond academia in some unexpected ways.
As we talked about, Anderson offered a really comprehensive and challenging philosophical system. His unwavering emphasis on independence, his specific way of explaining how logic and ontology relate, and his naturalistic approach to ethics all provide a ton of stuff for philosophers to think about and engage with.
And that brings us to our final thought-provoking question for you, our fellow philosopher. Given Anderson's strong critique of the problem of knowledge and his idea that being there and so is primary, how could his perspective shake up contemporary debates in epistemology and the philosophy of mind? Could his focus on actual human practices offer a good alternative to those more abstract and theoretical approaches to ethics? It's a rich area for more philosophical thinking.
It is. And if you're interested in digging deeper into Anderson's thought, we definitely recommend checking out that big bibliography in the Stanford Encyclopedia entry. Maybe start with some of his well-known students like Armstrong, or revisit some of those key Greek philosophers who had such a big impact on him, like Heraclitus. Think about how Anderson's ideas connect with or challenge your own philosophical commitments. It's a deep and rewarding well to draw from for anyone interested in philosophical inquiry.